So I've been reading my trusty Connell guide to Romeo and Juliet quite a bit recently, and I've discovered that William Shakespeare did not actually invent the Romeo and Juliet story. But what do I mean by that? Let's find out. How's it going, Revision Squad? It's me, Liam, aka Mr. Knight, aka DystopiaJunkie, and in this video we will be discussing the literary sources that Shakespeare drew upon as he wrote Romeo and Juliet, because he didn't actually totally make up the story himself. Now, the reason why I'm making this video is because knowing about Romeo and Juliet's literary ancestors will not only allow you to understand which traditions Shakespeare was following as he wrote his play, but it will also allow you to more clearly see which deviations or alterations he made, which should also help you to consider what specific statements he was trying to make with his play. Knowing about Romeo and Juliet's literary ancestors and its subtle deviations from its source texts will help to give you an insightful and perceptive understanding of the play, which should help you to get those top grades. All of this, I hope, will help you out as you are studying or revising Romeo and Juliet. If it does, you can let me know by giving this video a like, writing a comment on it, sharing it with anybody else who you think might find it helpful, and of course subscribing to my channel if you aren't already. Your support is greatly appreciated, so thank you so much in advance. Now, before we find out about Shakespeare's sources for writing Romeo and Juliet, let's have a quick word from today's sponsors. This video is made in collaboration with Connell Guides. For access to the most intelligent study guides on the market for GCSE and A-level English literature, as well as GCSE and A-level history, visit connellguides.com. As a special discount for the Revision Squad, apply code RS15, all in capital letters, at checkout for 15% off your order. Okay, so in this video we are going to talk about the two different types of sources for Romeo and Juliet, which are the play's indirect sources and its direct sources. I will warn you now, there's going to be a lot of Greek, Italian and French words and names in this video, and although I have tried my best to get everything totally spot on, I do apologise in advance for any errors. So, by an indirect source, I mean something that has generic similarities with Romeo and Juliet. Something that exists within the same literary cosmos as Shakespeare's play, but is something that Shakespeare probably was not explicitly drawing on or responding to as he wrote Romeo and Juliet. Most of these sources are also much older than Shakespeare's play itself too. By a direct source then, I mean any text that Shakespeare was clearly adapting, appropriating or tweaking when he wrote Romeo and Juliet. As we will see in this video, there are several literary ancestors that Shakespeare's play directly descends from. These are also texts that we can say Shakespeare would have most likely been aware of in some way, even if he didn't actually quite know that himself. Now, I will be working through these sources in chronological order, eventually ending with Romeo and Juliet, written right at the end of the 16th century. But, to begin with, let's go all the way back to the year 8, yeah that's right, 8 AD, which is when our first indirect source of Romeo and Juliet, Ovid's Metamorphoses, and in particular the story of Pyramus and Thisbe, was published. But how is the story of Pyramus and Thisbe an indirect source for Shakespeare's play? In other words, what similarities do they share? Well, the story of Pyramus and Thisbe is an old story about two rival families and a forbidden love shared between members of those families. Furthermore, it features a blossoming relationship that is enshrouded in secrecy. In this story, Pyramus and Thisbe's families are neighbours whose houses share a wall. The two lovers, as you can see, secretly communicate through a crack in this connecting wall. They dare not communicate openly because of the rivalry their families share. Already, I hope you can see the parallels with this story and that of Romeo and Juliet. But those are not the only parallels. The lovers plan to meet at a tomb. Their plan goes wrong, and when this plan does go wrong, the male lover commits suicide, believing that his lover is dead. Following this, when the female lover finds her lover's dead body, she also kills herself. Now, I don't know about you, but this sounds very, very familiar, doesn't it? All of this is to say that there was a tradition of tragic love stories almost 16 centuries before Shakespeare wrote Romeo and Juliet. He certainly did not invent this type of story. And the thing is, we know that Shakespeare was actually quite familiar with this story, as he mentions it in another of his plays. For those of you who have studied A Midsummer Night's Dream somewhere in your time at school, I'm sure you know exactly what I mean. The story of Pyramus and Thisbe is not the only indirect source of Romeo and Juliet's story. Scholars generally believe that Xenophon of Ephesus's Ephesian tale of Anthea and Habracomes, which is written somewhere in the second half of the 2nd century, vaguely influenced Shakespeare's play too. But why do they think that? Well, there are a number of reasons. Firstly, a young couple, namely Anthea and Habracomes, meet and fall in love at a celebratory event, much like how Romeo and Juliet meet and fall in love at the Capulet ball. Secondly, fate plays a part in their lives, or rather, interferes in it. In this story, a fortune teller predicts that pirates, tombs, fire and blood will all feature in the two lovers' relationship, and generally make their lives a little bit more difficult. And that is precisely what happens, because as they head off to Egypt to get married, pirates board their ship, take them captive, and split them up. What rotten luck. Another similarity is that the female lover is forced to marry another man, although she is very, very unhappy about this, and so she decides to drink a poisonous potion. Obviously, Juliet never actually marries Paris in Shakespeare's play, but the forced marriage and consumption of a potion certainly sounds familiar. Last of all, tombs feature quite a bit at the end of this story, just like they do at the end of Romeo and Juliet. After the stories from Ovid and Xenophon of Ephesus, one other indirect source that I will mention for now is Dante and his Divine Comedy. Now, the Divine Comedy is a long narrative poem that is about the state of the soul after death, and is generally considered to be one of the greatest poems from the Middle Ages and one of the most important pieces of Italian literature ever. Now, there's quite a bit that I could say about the Divine Comedy, but the bit that is really relevant for us here is that it contains one of the earliest references to the surnames Montague and Capulet, as Dante mentions the Montecchi and the Cappelletti families in his poem. Although that might seem quite unimportant for me to mention, the significance of Dante's Divine Comedy suggests that it may have had a very, very small influence on Shakespeare's play. But let's leave those indirect sources alone for a bit. Instead, let's have a look at our first direct source of Romeo and Juliet, which is Masuccio Salernitano's story Mariotto e Ganozza, published in 1476. This story, as you'll see in a moment, follows in the tradition of tragic love stories established by stories like Pyramus and Thisbe and Anthea and Habracomes. For instance, Mariotto e Ganozza features a secret marriage between two lovers, which recalls the secret love in the story of Pyramus and Thisbe and has obvious parallels with Shakespeare's play. Furthermore, in Salernitano's story, the male lover is exiled for committing murder, thus separating the two lovers, as in the tale of Anthea and Habracomes. Other similarities
Mariotto e Canozza,
shares with Romeo and Juliet include the fact that the female lover
Canozza,
has a marriage arranged for her. She makes herself appear dead at one point during the story. There is a helpful friar who assists the lovers. And, importantly, a message is not received by one of the lovers, which ultimately brings about both of their deaths. Now, all of these ideas, I'm sure you will agree, apply to Romeo and Juliet. However, one important distinction is that Salernitano's story is actually quite misogynistic. Throughout his writings, Salernitano presents
Canozza
as inferior to Mariotto, blames her for jeopardizing the honor of the two families, and ultimately denies her a heroic death, instead ending her story with her running away to a nunnery and starving herself to death. Keep this misogynistic attitude towards
Canozza
in mind as we move forwards. After Salernitano's story in 1476, we get another story from Luigi da Porto in 1531, which he entitled Giulietta e Romeo. But how does this story influence Shakespeare's play? Well, first of all, he set his story in Verona. Salernitano's story was actually set in Siena, another prominent Italian city roughly 300 kilometers away from Verona. Although a minor change to have made, it seems to have been one that survived the test of time, for Verona is of course where Shakespeare sets Romeo and Juliet. Furthermore, da Porto also changed and established the names of several characters. It is possible that he drew upon Dante's Divine Comedy, for he names the families the Montecchi and the Capuletti, which is very similar to the names put forward by Dante. Furthermore, you can see that it was him who called the lovers Romeo and Giulietta, Giulietta of course being just another form of Juliet. His name for the friar, Frate Lorenzo, also stuck. When anglicised, this name becomes Friar Lawrence, and so we now have a helpful friar, as per Salernitano's story, but we also have one who is now called Lawrence, just like the one Shakespeare uses in his story. Da Porto also introduced several new characters to his version of Salernitano's story, such as Mercutio, Tybalt, Paris, and the nurse. He also included several key plot elements and scenes in his version of the story, including the family feud, Romeo meeting the Giulietta character at a party at her house, and Romeo murdering his lover's cousin, Tybalt, rather than just some random civilian, as in Salernitano's story. Other elements that da Porto invented for his story that survived in Shakespeare's play include Romeo drinking poison to kill himself, Giulietta stabbing herself with Romeo's dagger, and the families reconciling after their children die, thus ending the feud. Also, da Porto's story is quite fast-paced and dramatic, making it seem quite intense and full-on, much like the passion shared between the two lovers in this story. One final observation from me is that da Porto's story loses the misogyny of Salernitano's, presenting Romeo and Giulietta in much more even terms. After da Porto's story in 1531, we have Matteo Bandello's Novelle, the second edition of which was published in 1554 and contained his take on the Giulietta e Romeo story. So in Bandello's book Novelle, he included a version of the Giulietta e Romeo story, which was actually quite similar to da Porto's story, but he slowed it down quite a bit with long descriptive stretches of prose and several lengthy speeches from some of the main characters, which may have eventually become the long soliloquies that Shakespeare gave Romeo, Juliet, and Friar Lawrence, to name but a few examples. One of the few inventions brought about by Bandello was the creation of Benvolio, Romeo's cousin and close friend, who Shakespeare of course retains in his version of the story. Another change that we might want to notice is how Bandello turned Mercutio into an overpowering man who lacks respect, marking a significant deviation from how he behaved in da Porto's story. I suggest that we see elements of this aspect of Mercutio in Shakespeare's play, given that the man insults the nurse and gets very feisty on the day he is killed by Tybalt. Those are the significant developments offered by Bandello's version of the Romeo and Juliet story. Now, a handful of years after Bandello published his novelle, and therefore his version of the Giulietta e Romeo story, it was translated into French by Pierre Boistiau and included in his Histoire tragique in 1559. This translated version of the tale contains even more long speeches than Bandello's, giving increased precedent for the soliloquies Shakespeare made use of. This version was then translated into English by Arthur Brooke, who turned it into a narrative poem called The Tragical History of Romeo and Juliet in 1562. Brooke's translation is widely believed to be the first English translation of the Romeo and Juliet tale, which is important as the story suddenly became much more accessible to the English public at large. A few years later, there was another popular English translation of the story, although this time it was translated from Bandello's Italian story rather than from the French version. This translation was made by William Paynter in 1567 and included in his collection entitled Palace of Pleasure. This collection contained lots of different translations from classical Greek, Latin and Italian texts, and is believed to have contributed to the popularity of ancient stories in Elizabethan England. It is possible that Paynter made this translation in the knowledge of Brooke's successful translation a few years earlier. Now that is it for our direct sources, but I would like to quickly think about Shakespeare's indirect sources once more. You see, in the late 16th century, Shakespeare's fellow playwrights started to produce more and more tragic love stories, such as Christopher Marlowe, who wrote a play called Dido, Queen of Carthage. As such, these tragic love stories were something of a trend that Shakespeare, as both a playwright and a business person, would have been aware of. Now, speaking of Shakespeare, he produced Romeo and Juliet only a few years after Marlowe produced his play. Romeo and Juliet is thought to be a pretty faithful adaptation of Brooke's narrative poem, and it is generally accepted that Shakespeare was aware of Paynter's collection, given its popularity and the amount of other plays, including plays of Shakespeare's, that it had inspired. So, what can we say about Romeo and Juliet in relation to all of these various sources? Firstly, we could say that Romeo and Juliet follows in a long-standing tradition of tragic love stories. This was established by writers like Ovid and Xenophon of Ephesus in classical times, and was still being used and reused in his own time, as shown by the tragic love stories written by Shakespeare's contemporaries. It is clear, I hope, that Shakespeare used the setting, characters and plot put forward by Salernitano, da Porto and Bandello. However, compared to the versions written by Bandello and translated by Boistiau and Brooke, Shakespeare's version of Romeo and Juliet occurs over a much shorter time span. Their prose and poetic versions of this story took place over several months, whereas Shakespeare's version takes place over a small handful of days. Now, this could partly be because of the demands and constraints of theatre, but it could also be because Shakespeare wanted to create a much more intense and dramatic story. However, Shakespeare did not just straight up copy these stories. He made his own adaptations and tweaks, not only to the play's timeline, but also to its characters. Notably, he tweaked both Mercutio and the nurse. Although rude and feisty at times, Mercutio is also quite a comic character, as is the nurse, who is more than the humble and respectful servant present in some of the sources. So with all that in mind, wasn't Shakespeare just copying other people's stories? Well, yes and no. You see, Adapting and reworking stories was pretty common practice in Italian literature between the 1300s and 1500s, and so you could just say that Shakespeare was just following in this tradition, given Romeo and Juliet's Italian origins. Additionally, it was also pretty normal for Elizabethan playwrights to adapt popular pre-existing stories. This meant that they could more easily draw in a crowd who wanted to see stories that they were somewhat familiar with. It also meant that, with a bigger crowd, Elizabethan playwrights could entertain more people and, at the end of the day, make more money. However, let's not be too cynical and end this video on a money-based observation. As much as Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet is based off of many older tales, Shakespeare still wrote this play. The beautiful language found throughout it
is his work.
Furthermore, it is in his deviations and alterations from these source texts where some of Shakespeare's originality can be found. Is Juliet's maturation, which seems to be something Shakespeare introduced to the story, intended to celebrate women's autonomy? Is the heavy influence of fate on the play's plot Shakespeare's way of highlighting the powerlessness of man against greater forces? Was Shakespeare's juxtaposition of tragedy and comedy, as demonstrated by the play's structure, his way of reminding us that life comes with extreme highs and extreme lows, and that we should not just romanticize love? I'll leave that for you to think about. Because that is the end of this video. Thank you all so much for watching. I hope you have found this video to be helpful and informative, and that you now feel a bit more confident when it comes to studying or revising Shakespeare's play as a result. Thanks also to the sponsor of today's video, Connell Guides, because without their support, this video would not have been possible. If you have made it this far, please do not forget to like, comment and subscribe, and remember, as always, that I hope that you have an awesome rest of the day. If you are revising, please do take frequent short breaks, as a burned out student is not a happy or successful student, which is what I think you deserve to be. So it turns out that Shakespeare did not invent the Romeo and Juliet story, and instead he wrote his play by adapting several other pre-existing stories. But the thing is, it doesn't really matter. There is still plenty of originality in his work, in his deviations and alterations from those source texts, and, probably more importantly, in the beauty of the language that he uses to tell his story.